My dad slammed me against the wall and sneered, "His future matters, not yours," because I refused to cancel a life-changing job interview to chauffeur my golden child brother. So, I walked out the door, got the job anyway, and eventually uncovered the $178,000 financial fraud my parents had secretly built in my name, a discovery that ended with my childhood home foreclosed and my father in a bright orange jumpsuit. I grew up in Bakersfield, California, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. It is oil country, agriculture central, flat as a forgotten pancake, blistering hot for 9 months out of the year, and full of people who either struck it rich in the fields or are grinding their teeth to dust trying to survive the week. Guess which category I fell into? Up until I was 25 years old, I was still living in my parents' single-story ranch house, and it absolutely wasn't because I wanted to be there. Trust me, I would have much rather bunked in a climate-controlled storage unit behind the local Target. But ever since I graduated high school, I had been bouncing endlessly between grueling warehouse gigs, overnight delivery routes, and manual labor jobs, desperately trying to save enough cash to escape. The main reason I couldn't save? I was paying $450 a month in rent to my own parents. Yes, you read that correctly. They started charging me rent the exact day I turned 18. Happy birthday, Jax, here is your itemized invoice, the celebratory cake is extra. Meanwhile, my younger brother Bryce, who was 21 at the time, had never paid a single dime to live there. He had never worked a real job, either. He was currently in his 4th year of a 2-year generic business degree at the local community college, somehow remaining permanently on the family payroll, and driving a lifted, custom-painted truck that cost more than I had earned in the past 3 years combined. Our parents loved to call him entrepreneurial. I preferred to call him a professional mooch with a charismatic smile and zero work ethic, but what did I know? The favoritism wasn't just subtle, it was a bludgeon they hit me with daily. Whenever Bryce needed spending money for a weekend trip, it magically materialized out of nowhere. Whenever I needed help with literally anything, a flat tire, a medical bill, a small loan to fix my radiator, there was always a rehearsed reason it simply couldn't happen. It's a tight month, Jax. We have unexpected expenses. Bryce's truck needs new suspension. You understand, right, Jax? You're the responsible one. That was their favorite word. Responsible. I learned very early on that responsible was just parental code for the kid we don't have to worry about or invest in, because he'll figure it out himself, while we hyper-focus all our resources on the kid who can't tie his own shoes without a designated supervisor. I understood I was the family workhorse. I only got acknowledged when something heavy needed lifting, when something broken needed fixing, or when someone needed covering for. Case in point, my beloved toolbox. I had spent 4 years buying high-quality tools piece by piece with my meager warehouse paychecks. Bryce borrowed them constantly. He never asked, he just strolled into the garage, took whatever he needed for his little vanity projects, and left the rest scattered across the oily concrete. Half of my equipment came back stripped, broken, or simply never came back at all. When I finally snapped and complained to my mother about a $120 torque wrench he'd left out in the rain to rust, she crossed her arms and told me to stop being so selfish. Family shares, Jax. It was genuinely hilarious how sharing in that house only ever flowed in one specific direction. Then, I finally caught a massive break. Vanguard Mechanical, one of the absolute biggest and most respected HVAC outfits in the Central Valley, was taking applications for their elite apprenticeship program. This was the real deal. We are talking paid training, state certifications, full union benefits, and a concrete ladder to becoming a journeyman. It was the exact kind of rare opportunity that could instantly transform a dead-end minimum wage existence into an actual, lucrative career. I spent 2 agonizing weeks perfecting that application. I secured a glowing reference letter from my warehouse supervisor, a gruff guy named Marcus who had been in the trades for 30 years before his knees gave out. Marcus was good people. He sat me down in the break room, told me exactly what to say, how to confidently present myself, and what technical questions to expect. He even offered to let me borrow his pristine Honda Accord to drive to the interview, since my own vehicle, a beat-up sedan, was currently held together by sheer willpower, rust, and industrial duct tape. The night before the interview, I was standing in the sweltering kitchen, meticulously ironing my one decent button-down shirt. The house was quiet, but sound carries effortlessly through the thin drywall of a cheap ranch home. I heard my parents talking in low voices in the adjacent living room. I wasn't actively trying to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help it. Bryce needs another $1,000 for this semester, my father muttered. Registration fees or something. Didn't we already cover his tuition last month? My mother asked. We did, he says there were some extra costs. Extra costs. Right. I had seen Bryce's extra costs firsthand. A brand new dual monitor gaming setup, weekend snowboarding trips up to the mountains with his girlfriend, expensive designer sneakers. The kind of absolute luxury expenses that magically showed up whenever his bank account dipped low, which was perpetually. But here is the part that truly made my blood run cold. My mother sighed softly and responded, "It's fine. We'll just pull it from the education fund." The education fund? I stood there frozen, holding a hissing hot iron, feeling like someone had just violently knocked the wind out of me. I had been explicitly told, repeatedly, since I was 16 years old, that there was absolutely zero money for my education. That was the entire reason I hadn't gone to college. That was the reason I had been grinding my bones to dust in unair-conditioned warehouses while Bryce floated through his existence on a plush cloud of endless parental subsidies. That was why I was 25, paying rent to sleep in a cramped bedroom that used to be a home office. There times was times an education fund. It just wasn't for me. It had never been for me. I finished ironing my shirt in dead silence. I walked to my room, laid in bed, and stared at the cracked ceiling until 4 in the morning, doing the agonizing mental math I should have done years ago. Every single time I had been told no. Every golden opportunity I had watched walk right past me because we allegedly couldn't afford it. Every agonizing sacrifice I had made while my brother collected shiny participation trophies just for breathing. This interview tomorrow wasn't just a career opportunity anymore. It was my literal escape hatch. It was undeniable proof that I could build an entire life without them. And apparently, that independence scared the absolute hell out of somebody in that house. Morning came entirely too fast. I was up at 6 a.m. I showered until the water ran cold, dressed carefully, and spent an hour running through Marcus's interview scenarios in my head while trying to eat dry toast without getting crumbs on my pristine collar. The apprenticeship started at $18 an hour during basic training, with an immediate bump to $25 once you passed your core certification. It meant stability, health benefits, and a future that didn't involve laying awake wondering if my engine would finally give up and leave me stranded on the side of Highway 99. Bryce rolled out of bed around 9:30 a.m. On most days, he didn't surface until noon. He was wearing expensive basketball shorts and a designer graphic tee that probably cost more than my entire interview outfit. He sauntered into the kitchen, made himself a massive bowl of cereal, the obscenely expensive organic stuff my parents bought specifically for him, and sat down at the table, aggressively scrolling through his phone like the universe owed him continuous entertainment. "Hey," he mumbled around a mouthful of milk, "I need you to drive me to Chloe's place." Chloe was his girlfriend. She lived about 25 minutes outside of town on her family's sprawling agricultural property. She was a genuinely nice girl, way too good for him, but that wasn't my business. I checked my watch. My interview was at 11 a.m. sharp. I absolutely had to leave by 10 a.m. to ensure I had plenty of buffer time. You do not show up to a potential career-defining interview running hot, sweaty, and panicked because you cut the traffic too close. First impressions in the trades matter immensely, and showing up flustered screams that you cannot manage your time or handle pressure. "Can't," I replied evenly. "I've got an interview at 11. He didn't even bother to look up from his glowing screen. "So reschedule it. Chloe and I have plans to go to the lake. I've been waiting 3 months for this specific interview," I said, my voice hardening. "And I've been waiting to see my girlfriend. Take an Uber, take the bus." "I don't know, Bryce, but I'm not driving you." I told him no. That was, apparently, a catastrophic error in the ecosystem of our house. Bryce was not used to hearing that word, especially not from his subservient older brother. His entire spoiled life had been meticulously built around the rock-solid assumption that other people would automatically bend their schedules to accommodate him. He slammed his spoon down, left the kitchen without another word, and stomped down the hallway. A minute later, I heard him whining to my mother. He used the exact entitled tone of someone who had never faced a minor inconvenience in his life, and lacked the emotional maturity to process it. Within 5 minutes, my mother appeared in the doorway of my bedroom. Her arms were cross-tight, her face set in that deeply disappointed, judgmental expression she had perfected over 2 decades. "Jax, why can't you just help your brother this once?" This once. Like I hadn't spent the last 25 years functioning as the family's unpaid, unappreciated free help. Like I hadn't rearranged my grueling work schedule, sacrificed my limited weekends, and bent over backward 1,000 times just so the golden child could do whatever he pleased. "You know how important Chloe is to him," she pressed. "And this interview is important to me," I fired back, zipping my portfolio. "Why does his leisure activity automatically override my career?" "Because family supports each other, Jax." "Mom, when is the last time anyone in this family supported me?" She didn't have an answer for that. She just pressed her thin lips together and gave me that familiar, icy look. The look that clearly communicated she thought I was just being incredibly difficult on purpose to ruin their morning. I stood my ground. I calmly told her I was going to this interview no matter what happened. Bryce could figure out his own transportation like a functional adult, or he could wait until someone else was available to chauffeur him. That is exactly when my father came storming through the front door. He had supposedly been at a landscaping job site across town, but he was back by 9:50 a.m., which meant my mother had frantically called him to come deal with my sudden rebellion. He found me in my room doing a final, nervous check of my documents. I had my printed application, A crisp copy of my OSHA certifications, Marcus's glowing reference letter, all perfectly organized in a pristine manila folder. I was ready to show Vanguard I was deadly serious. "Your mother says you're refusing to help your brother," my father barked, his face already flushed with anger. "I have a massive interview in an hour. A life-changing one. Bryce has social commitments. They aren't the same. Bryce is Otto." I looked right into his eyes, desperately trying to see if there was any shred of self-awareness there, any microscopic recognition of how completely insane his demand was. I found absolutely nothing. Just the same flat, aggressive certainty he had always possessed, the unwavering belief that whatever he decided was automatically the law of the land. "Driving to his girlfriend's house isn't a commitment, Dad. It's a convenience." We argued. It escalated fast. He pulled out all of his greatest hits. I was ungrateful, selfish, arrogant, too big for my britches. Driven by the exhaustion and the anger of the previous night, I made the fatal mistake of mentioning the education fund I had overheard them discussing. The magical fund that apparently existed solely for Bryce, but had been a cruel ghost story my entire life. The fund that couldn't afford a single textbook for my trade school but could easily cover Bryce's 4th year of partying at community college. Something dark and twisted shifted in my father's expression. He stepped closer, invading my space. "You remember that big state certification test you missed 2 years ago, when your car broke down on the highway?" I remembered it vividly. I had been utterly devastated. I had sat baking on the side of the sweltering asphalt for 3 hours waiting for a cheap tow truck while my phone battery died, helplessly watching my scheduled appointment time come and go. I had called the testing center from Marcus's phone later, practically begging to reschedule, but they had already given my coveted spot away. The registration fee was strictly non-refundable. It had set me back $500 that I absolutely did not have, forcing me to eat ramen for a month. My father smiled. It was a cold, cruel smirk. "A fuel pump is real easy to disconnect, Jax. Real easy to reconnect, too. Once you're not needed to be somewhere else." The words registered slowly in my brain. He had sabotaged my car. My own biological father had deliberately crawled under my vehicle and destroyed my chance at a professional certification just so I would be stuck at home and forced to help Bryce move into his new luxury apartment that weekend. "Family comes first, Jax. When are you finally going to learn your place?" Something went dead quiet inside of me. It was a terrifying, crystal clear clarity. The kind of absolute peace that only comes when you've been staring at a confusing, painful puzzle for 2 decades, and suddenly, violently, all the jagged pieces click into place. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just calmly told him I was going to my interview, and I moved to walk past him toward the bedroom door. That is when he lunged. He grabbed me by the collar of my freshly ironed shirt, hoisted me off balance, and violently slammed me back against the drywall. My head bounced off the plaster with a sickening thud. My mother appeared in the hallway. She gasped, covering her mouth with both hands, but she didn't step forward. She didn't say a single word. She didn't do a single thing to stop the man choking her son. Bryce was standing right behind her. He had this smug, entertained little expression on his face, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the violence like he was enjoying a premium movie. I didn't fight back. I just reached up, firmly grabbed my father's thick wrists, and peeled his hands off my neck with a strength born of pure adrenaline. I looked at him for a long, heavy moment. I memorized his face. I memorized the sick satisfaction in his eyes, the complete and utter absence of regret. My mother finally found her pathetic voice. "Jax, he didn't mean." "Yeah," I rasped, rubbing my throat. "He did." I bent down, picked up my folder of scattered documents from the carpet, brushed the dust off my slacks, and walked straight out the front door. I didn't look back. I drove Marcus's borrowed car to the parking lot of a filthy gas station about 3 miles from my parents' house before my hands finally started shaking. The fight or flight adrenaline was rapidly wearing off, replaced by a bizarre, intoxicating mix of profound anger and absolute relief. It felt like I had been waiting my entire life for explicit permission to leave, and my father had finally granted it to me in the most messed up way imaginable. The cracked bathroom mirror in the gas station showed a vicious red welt blooming rapidly along my left cheekbone where my face had clipped the doorframe during the struggle. My pristine shirt was hopelessly wrinkled and stretched at the collar where he had grabbed me. I had exactly 40 minutes to pull myself together and show up to the most important interview of my life. I pulled out my phone, took a clear, brightly lit picture of my bruised face, and texted it to Marcus with one single line. If something happens to me today, it was my father. Then, I did what I had to do. I splashed freezing sink water on my face, rigorously tucked my shirt back in, and ran wet fingers through my hair to tame it. The mark on my face was getting darker by the minute, aggressively heading toward a horrific purple bruise that would be absolutely impossible to hide or casually explain away. But I decided right then that I wasn't going to hide it. I wasn't going to invent some pathetic, cowardly story about walking into a cabinet or tripping over a dog. If the interviewers asked, I would tell them the unvarnished truth. If that honesty cost me the opportunity, At least I would know exactly what kind of corporate culture I was dealing with. Vanguard Mechanical was headquartered in a massive corrugated metal complex on the industrial east side of town. It was practical, imposing, and built to survive the relentless California sun. I arrived exactly 12 minutes early, checked in with a receptionist who gave my battered face a deeply concerned, wide-eyed look, and sat in the waiting area. The man who eventually came out to get me was a towering, barrel-chested guy in his late 50s with a handshake that felt like an industrial vice grip. He introduced himself as Vince Thornton, the senior operations manager. He had been with the company since he was 18, working his way up from a lowly apprentice sweeping floors to running the entire regional show. The very first thing his sharp eyes locked onto was the massive, darkening bruise on my cheek. Hard to miss that, Vince rumbled, leaning against the doorframe. Rough morning? I could have lied. I could have deflected, but I was so utterly exhausted from pretending. My father threw me against a wall because I refused to cancel this interview to drive my adult brother to his girlfriend's house. Vince's thick gray eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He was dead quiet for a long, calculating moment. Then, he slowly nodded. How far did you have to drive to get here after that happened? About 12 miles. I stopped at a Chevron station to fix my collar and wash the blood off my neck. Vince made a low sound in his chest, somewhere between a gruff grunt and a genuine laugh. Come on back to my office, kid, let's talk. The interview went exceptionally well. Vince asked probing questions about my limited experience, my long-term goals, and why I specifically wanted to get into the brutal world of commercial HVAC. I told him the absolute truth. I told him I had been grinding through nowhere jobs for years, helplessly watching opportunities slip past because I couldn't afford the fees or didn't have the right familial connections. I told him I wanted to build something real. Something tangible. Something that was entirely mine, that nobody could ever sabotage or take away from me. Why HVAC? Vince challenged, leaning over his massive oak desk. Why not just find another cushy warehouse gig driving a forklift? Because warehouse gigs don't go anywhere, I answered without hesitation. I've watched good men do that for 20 years, break their backs, and end up exactly where they started. I want to actually build a skill. I want to trade. Vince stared at me. Most kids your age just want the direct deposit. They don't want to hear about the physical grind. They don't want to crawl through 120-degree attics. Sir, I've been grinding my whole life just to survive my own house. I might as well grind toward a paycheck that matters. Vince smiled then. He told me about his own rough path. He started as a helper, learned the incredibly complex trade from the ground up, and eventually bought into the company as a managing partner. He said he had seen hundreds of kids come through the apprenticeship program, and the ones who actually made it to journeyman weren't always the smartest or the most naturally talented. They were simply the ones who showed up. Day after day. Through the exhausting parts, the boring parts, and the agonizing parts where your body screamed at you to quit. At the very end of the hour-long interview, Vince leaned back in his leather chair and looked at me intensely. You got a safe place to stay tonight? The sudden, personal question caught me completely off guard. I honestly hadn't thought about it. In my desperate rush to get to the interview, I had been operating on pure survival autopilot. Go to interview. Do not fail. Worry about sleeping later. Deal with the explosive fallout when you have to. I swallowed hard and admitted I wasn't sure. I said I would probably find a cheap motel on the edge of town and figure it out from there. Vince didn't say a word. He just pulled out his cell phone, dialed a number, and put it on speaker. A gruff voice answered. Vince spoke to a man named Earl, asking if the spare storage room above his auto shop was still empty. Apparently, it was. Vince hung up and looked at me. My buddy Earl runs an independent auto repair place down on 7th Street. He's got a room above the main garage he mostly uses for hoarding old parts, but there's a heavy-duty cot, a working sink, and a bathroom. It's not the Ritz, but it's free, and it's safe. You can crash there while you figure your life out. I didn't know what to say. The lump in my throat was the size of a golf ball. I had walked into this corporate building expecting to answer clinical questions about my mechanical aptitude, and instead, I was being offered a literal lifeline by a man I had known for exactly 45 minutes. Man. I really appreciate that, Mr. Thornton, thank you. He shrugged casually. In the trades, we look out for our own. Now, I can't make you any official promises yet. You've got a second technical interview with our lead journeyman on Thursday, then a safety walkthrough, then the usual mountain of HR paperwork and a drug test. But assuming all that goes smooth, you'd be looking at a start date next Monday at 6 a.m. sharp. I'll be there, I promised. I shook his massive hand and walked out of that air-conditioned building feeling like, maybe, for the first time in 25 years, the universe was finally moving in the right direction. Thursday's second interview was rigorous but went perfectly. The lead journeyman was a heavily tattooed guy named Diego, quiet and incredibly serious, who asked rapid-fire, practical questions about my work ethic, how I handled extreme heat, and what I knew about basic electrical systems. The drug test came back totally clean, the HR paperwork got filed, and by Friday afternoon, I had a confirmed start date and a Vanguard uniform. Earl, Vince's buddy, ran a massive repair shop that looked like it had been standing since the Eisenhower administration. The concrete floors were permanently stained with decades of spilled oil, the massive aluminum bay doors creaked like tortured metal when you opened them, and there was a permanent, thick smell of motor oil, exhaust, and welding flux baked into every single surface. Earl was a compact, wiry guy in his 60s with grease permanently embedded in his knuckles and a laugh that sounded like a rusty engine turning over. "So, you're the kid Vince called about," Earl said, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He looked me up and down, his eyes pausing on my heavily bruised cheek. "Nice shiner. Who did you tick off? An ex-girlfriend?" "My father," I said flatly. Earl stopped wiping his hands. His expression softened instantly. "Yeah, those are the worst ones, kid. Come on, I'll show you the room." The room was exactly as advertised. It was a dusty, cavernous space above the main base. It featured a metal cot that had probably been military surplus during the Vietnam War, a terrifying space heater that looked like an active fire hazard, a tiny bathroom with water pressure that violently fluctuated between a pathetic trickle and a blasting fire hose, and stacks of cardboard storage boxes lining the walls. But it had a solid door with a deadbolt, and a small, dirty window that looked out over the quiet alleyway. To me, it was the most beautiful penthouse I had ever seen. I crashed on that stiff cot that night, sleeping deeper and more peacefully than I had in my entire life. There were no heavy footsteps pacing overhead. There were no passive-aggressive, guilt-tripping comments waiting for me at breakfast. There was no suffocating feeling of being an unwanted parasite in my own home. There was just glorious silence and the distant, soothing hum of highway traffic. I woke up the next morning to exactly 28 frantic, angry text messages from my mother. I didn't read a single one. I swiped left and deleted the entire notification thread without opening it. The next morning, Marcus brought his truck to help me get my remaining belongings from my parents' house. I had called him late the night before, explaining the chaotic situation in broad strokes. He didn't pry or ask a lot of invasive questions. He just promised he would pick me up at 7 a.m., and we would handle the extraction together. "You absolutely sure about this, Jax?" Marcus asked as we pulled into my parents' familiar driveway. "Once you pack your bags and walk out with a witness, that's it. You're burning the bridge." "I've been sure for years," I replied, staring at the front door. "I just needed a violent push." Marcus nodded solemnly. "Sometimes family is the hardest cancer to cut out, even when they're the ones actively killing you." My mother was waiting in the living room when we unlocked the door. She had clearly been expecting me to come crawling back alone, ready to beg for forgiveness. Marcus's imposing, protective presence completely threw her off balance. It is incredibly hard to play the weeping, victimized martyr when there is a stoic, unimpressed third-party witness standing there who isn't buying a second of your theatrical act. "Jax, you didn't need to bring a stranger into our home," she hissed, wringing her hands. "We are a family. We can sit down and talk about this minor disagreement in private." I walked right past her without making eye contact or responding. Marcus followed me down the hall, staying close, a silent guardian. Packing my entire life took exactly 20 minutes. Everything I truly owned easily fit into 4 medium cardboard boxes and 1 faded canvas duffel bag. A few clothes, some worn paperbacks, the surviving tools I had bought myself, and my cheap laptop. That was the pathetic sum total of 25 years of existence in that house. You would think a person would accumulate more, but you don't gather much when you are treated like a temporary, burdensome guest who wildly overstayed his welcome. I was grabbing my crucial documents from my desk drawer when I noticed the thick manila envelope was entirely gone. My birth certificate, my social security card, my vehicle title, all the vital paperwork you need to legally prove you exist in the eyes of the government. "Where's my paperwork, Mom?" I demanded, walking back into the living room. "The envelope that was in my bottom drawer." She lifted her chin defensively. "Your father put it somewhere incredibly safe. He said he will personally hand it to you once you've calmed down from this ridiculous temper tantrum. This is just a phase, Jax. You'll see that soon enough. You can't survive out there alone." I looked at her for a long, quiet moment. I realized with absolute horror that she genuinely believed the delusional words coming out of her mouth. She truly thought I would fail, that I would come crawling back in a week, starving and broke, and they would hold my legal identity hostage until I submitted to their control again. "I'll just order replacements from the county," I said coldly. Her face instantly tightened. That was not the submissive response she had expected. She had expected me to scream, to argue, to desperately plead with her, giving her leverage to negotiate my return. Bryce finally sauntered out of his bedroom as we were loading the last box into Marcus's truck. He leaned casually against the porch railing with that same infuriating, smug expression, his arms crossed, watching us like a wealthy plantation owner supervising manual labor beneath his station. "Running away?" Bryce mocked, laughing softly. "That's your big master plan?" I slammed the heavy tailgate shut and turned to look at him. I felt Marcus tense up beside me, his fists clenching, ready to step in if Bryce tried anything stupid. "I spent 25 years cleaning up your messes, covering your tracks, and bailing you out," I said, my voice eerily calm. Bryce scoffed. "And what? Now you think you're going to make it in the real world on your own? Good luck with that, bro. You're nothing without Dad." "Dad. Consider this my early retirement from being your servant," I replied. He didn't have a witty comeback for that. He just stood there, his mouth hanging half open in confusion, as Marcus put the truck in drive and we pulled away from the curb. I watched Bryce shrink in the side mirror until he was just a pathetic, small figure on a fading porch. I never slept in that house again. Update 1. The Vanguard apprenticeship officially started on Monday. I was up at 4:30 a.m., showing up at the massive shop in stiff new work boots, ready to learn or die trying. Vince partnered me directly with Diego, the quiet journeyman for my interview. Diego was 35, had been doing commercial HVAC for 15 years, and had forgotten more about thermodynamics and electrical routing than most engineers ever learn. On the very first day, he looked me up and down, handed me a heavy tool belt, and said exactly one thing: "You going to show up sober and on time every single day?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "Then we'll get along fine." "Don't call me sir." Diego wasn't a talker, and he wasn't a coddler. He taught by aggressive doing. He expected you to watch his hands, absorb the complex process, and he only ever explained things once. If you weren't paying strict attention, that was your fatal problem. He didn't hold petty grudges, but he absolutely didn't hold hands, either. You either kept up with his grueling pace, or you washed out. The first 2 months were a blur of absolute physical brutality. I was up before dawn, hauling heavy Freon tanks and massive compressors up narrow ladders onto the scorching reflective roofs of commercial warehouses. I worked until my muscles screamed and cramped, then stayed up late studying thick technical manuals for my upcoming certifications in Earl's dusty storage room. I lived entirely on black gas station coffee, cheap canned soup, and sheer spite. I lost about 15 pounds of fat, gained thick, yellowed calluses on top of my calluses, and learned more about complex air handling units than I ever thought humanly possible. The room above Earl's garage truly became my sanctuary. I meticulously cleaned out the decades of hoarding, put up some cheap particle board shelves, and hung a heavy blackout blanket over the dirty window for privacy. Earl started letting me use the shop's professional hydraulic lifts and pneumatic tools after hours to desperately try and keep my dying car running. He had been a Marine infantryman back in his youth, done 2 brutal tours overseas, came home broken, and built this thriving shop from absolute scratch. One evening, about 4 weeks after I had moved in, Earl walked upstairs and tossed a heavy manila envelope onto my cot. Inside was a set of worn keys and the clean title to a battered but sturdy 2012 Chevy Express work van that had been sitting neglected in the corner of his gravel lot for 3 years. "What's this?" I asked, confused. "Keys to that white van out back," Earl grunted. "She runs fine, engine is bulletproof. Just needs some cosmetic work and a new alternator, which you're going to install yourself." "Earl, I can't take this. I don't have the cash to buy a vehicle right now. At least let me set up a payment plan." He waved me off aggressively. "You've been helping me sweep up the bays and close the shop every single night for a month. You never once asked for a dime or a favor. Call it a long-term loan. Just pay it forward someday when you're an old man in a position to help some desperate kid who needs a lucky break." That van became my absolute lifeline. It was reliable transportation, a massive space to securely store my growing collection of professional tools, and a guaranteed backup shelter if everything else in my life completely fell apart. I worked on restoring it every spare weekend moment I had. About a month and a half after I had walked out of my parents' house, I finally got my first real, full-time paycheck from Vanguard Mechanical. It was $1,146 after union dues and taxes. It wasn't millionaire money by any standard, but to me, holding that crisp piece of paper, it was undeniable, printed proof that I could survive and thrive without my toxic family. That exact same week, I walked into a local Chase branch to finally open a real checking account completely untethered from my parents. The banker, a polite woman in her 30s, typed my social security number into her computer. She frowned, typed it again, and then looked at me with deep concern. She informed me that the system was hard declining my application. She said I had severe negative reports tied directly to my SSN, and they couldn't legally open any accounts in-house until the massive delinquencies were resolved. She strongly recommended I pull a comprehensive credit report immediately to figure out what was going on. I went back to the shop, booted up my cheap laptop, and requested a full credit report from all 3 major bureaus. What downloaded to my screen made the physical abuse from my father look like a gentle warm-up act. I stared at the PDF, my stomach violently dropping to the floor. There were 4 high-limit credit cards I had never, ever applied for. There was a massive auto loan for a vehicle I had never seen or driven. There were high-interest store credit accounts at luxury electronics places I had never shopped at, monthly auto draft subscriptions to premium services I had never heard of, and a massive personal line of credit from a sketchy online bank that had been maxed out to the absolute limit and was currently in severe default. The total outstanding debt in my name was just over $38,000. I sat frozen at the greasy counter in Earl's garage, staring blindly at those terrifying numbers until the digits stopped making logical sense and just blurred together. 38 grand. That was substantially more money than I had made in the last 2 entire years of breaking my back in warehouses. That was the difference between scraping by and actually getting ahead. That was my financial future, secretly stolen, piece by piece, while I was too busy desperately trying to survive their house to notice the knife in my back. The itemized charges told a sickening, explicit story. There were thousands of dollars in high-end gaming equipment that perfectly matched the exact setup sitting on Bryce's desk. There were expensive designer clothes, luxury snowboarding gear, and regular, clockwork gas station purchases. There were massive monthly payments on enterprise business software that clearly tied to my father's failing landscaping company. There were massive bulk purchases for industrial tools and landscaping equipment from commercial suppliers I had never heard of. There was even a premium, $150 a month gym membership. I had never set foot in a commercial gym in my entire life, but apparently, on paper, I had been an elite VIP member for over 3 years. The absolute, undeniable smoking gun was buried deep in the Visa account statements from 2 months ago. One of the fraudulently opened credit cards had been used for an expensive online order, a premium wireless gaming headset that cost $450. When I later managed to pull the shipping confirmation, it showed the item was addressed to Bryce's exact name, delivered to my parents' home address. My stolen name was on the credit card paying for it. His real name was on the shipping label receiving it. He knew. Bryce knew exactly where the endless stream of money was coming from. The oldest fraudulent account dated back to the exact month I turned 18. They had been doing this to me for 7 long years. 7 years of secretly building a mountain of crippling debt in my name, making just enough minimum payments to keep the accounts active and avoid immediate collections, using me as their personal, unlimited slush fund. All while looking me dead in the eyes and telling me the family couldn't afford a $500 certification fee to help me get ahead in life. I thought about all the desperate times I had begged for basic financial help. The trade school applications I never submitted because the application fees were $50. The better apartments I couldn't even attempt to qualify for because I assumed my low income was the barrier. It turned out I had plenty of credit history, it just wasn't mine to use. My parents had built their entire lavish, fake lifestyle and failing business on the bedrock of my stolen social security number. I was the sacrificial foundation they had never told me about. I printed all 90 pages of the reports and took them straight to a lawyer. I couldn't afford a high-powered private attorney, but Vanguard's union rep pointed me toward a robust legal aid clinic downtown that handled severe fraud cases for reduced rates. The attorney I met with, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, had been doing this for 2 decades and had seen every depraved thing the Central Valley could throw at her. Family identity theft is disgustingly common, Sarah said, flipping through the highlighted pages of my ruin. Unfortunately, it's also incredibly hard to prosecute because 90% of victims inevitably back down. They don't want to press federal charges against their own mother or father. They let the family guilt them into eating the debt. I'm not one of those victims, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Sarah stopped flipping pages. She looked up, studying my face for a long moment. Good. Then let's talk about your actual options. The options were brutally straightforward. I could try to resolve it privately, which meant confronting my parents, begging them to take responsibility, and hoping they would somehow magically produce $38,000 to pay it off. Fat chance. Or, I could file a formal, devastating identity theft report with the local police department, the state fraud division, and the federal credit bureaus. This would launch a massive, unstoppable criminal investigation that would completely remove the debt from my name, but it would inevitably result in severe felony charges for whoever opened the accounts. You need to understand exactly what happens if we pull this trigger, Sarah warned me, leaning across her desk. Your father could end up in state prison for years. Your mother could face massive conspiracy and wire fraud charges, too. They will lose everything. I know. And you are completely okay with destroying them? Sarah, they had 25 years to treat me like a son, or even just a human being. They actively chose to treat me like a stolen credit card instead. File the report. Burn it down. Sarah nodded slowly, a fierce glint in her eye. I was really hoping you'd say that. Let's get to work. The criminal investigation moved agonizingly slowly at first. It was weeks of grueling paperwork, sworn affidavits, police interviews, and bank subpoenas. By the time the state fraud unit finished pulling the encrypted IP logs and banking records, about 4 months had passed. But once the seasoned financial investigators started herding the digital dots, my parents' entire house of cards violently collapsed. It turned out my father's landscaping business had been hemorrhaging money for over 5 years while he arrogantly maintained the public facade of a successful local businessman. He had been desperately covering the massive shortfalls through a chaotic combination of credit fraud, wildly unreported cash income, and creative invoicing that crossed the line from shady business practices into outright, grand theft felony fraud against his own clients. The identity theft wasn't even limited to just me. The investigators dug deeper and found identical, fraudulent patterns with a couple of our distant, elderly relatives, and at least 2 of my father's former undocumented employees who had mysterious accounts opened in their names. One of the employees was a guy who had worked for my father for a mere 6 months before quitting in disgust. He had been dealing with mysterious IRS and credit issues for years and never figured out where the phantom debt came from. The investigators connected those dots with terrifying speed, but the stolen credit cards were just the tip of the iceberg. The real, catastrophic damage was buried deep in the business ledgers. My father had been aggressively collecting massive 50% upfront deposits from wealthy clients for massive commercial landscaping jobs, sometimes $15,000 or $20,000 at a time, and then immediately using that cash to cover his own personal luxury expenses and Bryce's tuition. Instead of buying the required materials, he would string the furious clients along for months, do a fraction of the promised dirt work, and then completely ghost them when they threatened to sue. The district prosecutor eventually tallied up a staggering $95,000 in stolen client deposits that never went to actual jobs. And because my father was an idiot, the IRS eventually got involved in the investigation. It turns out he had been massively underreporting his business income for almost a decade, illegally paying his laborers under the table in cash to avoid payroll taxes, and brazenly writing off Bryce's personal luxury expenses as business equipment costs. The federal tax liability alone was close to $45,000 once the IRS added their ruinous penalties and compound interest. My mother had been completely in on it from day one. Her signature was on half the forged bank documents. Her personal email address was the master recovery account linked to the fraudulent credit cards. She couldn't play the ignorant, submissive housewife, because the digital forensics proved she had been managing the stolen accounts herself. Every single month, she had logged in from her laptop, made the minimum payments, checked the available balances, and moved stolen money around to fund their fake life. The first real, public consequence hit about 6 weeks after Sarah and I filed the initial police report. 2 plainclothes detectives showed up unannounced at one of my father's active job sites and started loudly asking pointed questions in front of his wealthy clients. Word travels stupidly fast in the blue-collar contractor circles out here, and news of an active felony fraud investigation spreads like a California wildfire. Within a month, his entire business had dried up completely. Absolutely nobody wanted to hire a contractor who was under active investigation for stealing deposits and identity theft. My mother desperately tried to reach me. She called from blocked numbers, burner phones, and even tried emailing me. I didn't respond to a single word. Whatever manipulative poison she had to say, I had heard it all before. The predictable guilt trips, the hysterical accusations, the rewritten history where they were the innocent victims of a misunderstanding and I was the cruel, ungrateful son who was destroying the family over a minor mistake. Bryce was even more incredibly predictable. He actually showed up at Earl's garage one Tuesday afternoon, driving his massive, expensive truck, clearly expecting to intimidate me into dropping the federal charges. I was in the back bay, deep inside an air handler unit, when I heard his whiny, aggressive voice echoing through the shop. "I know Jax is hiding in here. Tell him to come out and face me like a man," Bryce yelled. Earl met him at the main bay doors. Earl didn't say a word at first, he just stood there, holding a massive steel tire iron in his grease-stained hand, with a dead-eyed look that clearly communicated he knew exactly how to shatter a kneecap, and wasn't morally opposed to demonstrating it. "You're going to want to get back in that pretty little pavement princess truck and drive away very fast, son," Earl growled, his voice dangerously low. Bryce puffed out his chest, trying to look imposing. "Or what? You're going to hit me? I'll sue this whole filthy place into the ground." Earl took one slow, deliberate step forward. "Son, I've been in enough actual war zones to know you don't have the stomach for this one. Get off my property before I make you swallow your teeth." Bryce instantly folded. He scurried back to his truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of the gravel parking lot like a terrified teenager trying to salvage his pride. Earl watched him speed away, spat on the ground, and turned back to me as I wiped my hands on a rag. "Your brother seems like a real winner, Jax." Vince pulled me aside after work a few days later. He had heard about the explosive situation through the small-town grapevine. Word had gotten around the Union Hall that Vanguard's new apprentice was the one who had blown the whistle on his own corrupt family. "You holding up okay, kid?" Vince asked, handing me a cold Gatorade. "I'm working on it," I admitted, staring at the floor. Vince nodded, clapping a massive hand on my shoulder. "Family stuff is always the hardest pill to swallow. But you did the absolute right thing. People who are willing to steal from their own kid won't ever stop until someone forces them to stop. They just eventually find new victims. You stop the bleeding. Update 2. The legal fallout was incredibly messy, but the justice system eventually ground them down to dust. My father was formally charged with multiple felony counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and tax evasion. The district prosecutor had an absolute mountain of irrefutable digital evidence to bury him with. Once the massive paper trail was officially laid out in discovery, my father's expensive defense attorney realized they were completely cooked. He finally took a plea deal instead of getting utterly destroyed and facing 20 years at a jury trial. The official sentencing hearing came about 8 months after he took the plea. Sarah had meticulously prepared me for what to expect. She walked me through the emotional process, helped me understand what the judge would ask, but seeing it actively play out in a cold, mahogany courtroom was entirely different. It was harder, yet infinitely more satisfying, than I ever thought it would be. My mother sat on the stand, sobbing hysterically, trying to play the victimized housewife. She talked endlessly about how hard their financial lives had been, how they were just trying to provide a good life for their children. She made eye contact with me exactly once across the room, and I saw absolutely nothing that looked like genuine remorse. I just saw pure, unadulterated hatred that she had been caught. Bryce refused to speak to the judge at all. He sat slouched in the back gallery, looking like he would rather be literally anywhere else, occasionally checking his phone with an annoyed sigh until the bailiff sharply told him to put it away or face contempt. My father's slimy defense attorney tried every desperate angle for a lighter sentence. He tried painting me as a deeply vindictive, mentally unstable son with a petty grudge. He suggested the financial crimes were exaggerated by the bank, implying I had somehow consented to the credit cards and just forgot. None of his theatrics moved the judge an inch. The forensic documentation was too solid. The 7-year pattern of malicious theft was too obvious for anyone to ignore. When it was my turn, I stood up and gave my victim impact statement. I looked right at the judge, and I told the unvarnished truth. I detailed every hidden opportunity, every sabotage chance, every single dollar they had stolen from my future while looking me in the eyes and telling me the family couldn't afford to help me survive. The prosecutor backed up every single word I said with hard documentation. Bank records, IP logs, the timeline of luxury purchases, the credit card applications with my blatantly forged signature, and the damning emails between my parents discussing how to manage the stolen accounts without me finding out. When the prosecutor projected the shipping confirmation onto the screen, the $450 gaming headset with Bryce's name on the package, paid for with a Visa in my stolen name, a collective disgusted gasp echoed from the courtroom gallery. The final tally read into the official record was incredibly ugly. $38,000 stolen in my name alone. Another $20,000 stolen across the other victims once they widened the investigative scope. $95,000 in stolen client deposits. $45,000 in federal back taxes, penalties, and interest. My father had arrogant built a nearly $200,000 hole using other people's money, blood, and trust. Now, it was time to finally pay the bill. The judge didn't hold back. My father was sentenced to 5 hard years in state prison. My mother avoided prison by turning state's evidence against him, but she was hit with 5 years of strict felony probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and a massive court order to fully repay the debts they had run up in my name. The judge ordered immediate restitution from their liquid assets, which meant the immediate seizure and forced sale of the house. As the bailiffs clamped the heavy steel handcuffs onto my father's wrists to lead him away, he stopped and looked at me one last time. His face was purple with rage. "Are you happy now, Jax? You destroyed this family." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just stared right back into his eyes and said, "No, Dad, you destroyed this family. I just finally stopped helping you hide the bodies." The house I grew up in was forced into a short sale to cover a fraction of what they owed the victims. When my mother, now a convicted felon unable to find a decent job, couldn't keep up with the remaining mortgage payments, foreclosure swiftly followed a few months later. The toxic place I had grown up in was gone, liquidated by the bank to pay for the massive damage they had done. Bryce somehow miraculously avoided direct criminal charges. He had been just careful enough, or just lucky enough, to never have his actual signature on any of the directly incriminating banking documents. But his free ride was violently over. There were no more endless parental subsidies. There was no more fake education fund. There was no more luxury truck. It was aggressively repossessed by the bank in the middle of the night when the massive payments stopped, because it turned out those payments had been secretly coming from the fraudulent accounts. Last I heard through the grapevine, Bryce had entirely dropped out of community college. He was working the graveyard shift at a dirty gas station on the edge of town, and he was forced to live in the cramped basement of Chloe's parents' house, which I'm sure was exactly the glamorous, wealthy future he had always pictured for himself. Truly entrepreneurial. The money side of my life took much longer to fully sort out. The fraudulent accounts got officially frozen and closed. The debts got aggressively disputed with the bureaus using the court's criminal conviction as proof. My ruined credit report got cleaned up, piece by agonizing piece, over the course of about a year and a half. It wasn't fast, and it absolutely wasn't easy. I spent hundreds of hours on hold with hostile credit bureaus. I filled out enough legal paperwork to build a small house, and I learned more about the agonizing federal dispute process than any human being should ever have to. But by the end of it, my credit score had miraculously climbed back from the low 400s to a functional, healthy 720. I stayed in the dusty room above Earl's garage for about 8 months, before finally saving enough to find a clean, quiet studio apartment of my own. It was incredibly small, and the rent was cheap, but it was mine. It was paid for with honest money I had actually earned with my own 2 hands. The Vanguard apprenticeship led exactly where Vince promised it would. My official journeyman certification came through after about 2 years of grinding through grueling courses, brutal exams, and thousands of practical field hours. Vince promoted me to crew lead not long after that, which meant a massive raise to $45 an hour, a company truck, actual management responsibility, and a crew of green apprentices who looked up to me for answers. Diego, my stoic mentor, gave me a single, respectful nod when he heard the news, which from him was basically equivalent to a weeping standing ovation. Marcus and I stayed incredibly tight. He came to my official union certification ceremony, standing proudly in the back of the hall with Earl and Vince, all 3 of them looking like proud, surrogate uncles at a college graduation. We grabbed dinner afterward at a battered taco truck that Marcus swore was the absolute best in the entire Central Valley. He wasn't wrong. It was the best al pastor I've ever had, served on cheap paper plates in a pothole-filled parking lot, surrounded by people who actually cared about me. Earl eventually sold me that white Chevy work van outright. When I tried to hand him an envelope with $3,000 cash, he aggressively refused to take full price. He took a single $100 bill, shoved the rest back at me, and said I had already paid for the damn thing in sweat equity from all the late nights I had helped him close up the shop. I still drive it on the weekends, it still runs absolutely fine. It will probably outlast me at this rate. My mother actually reached out to me once, about a year after the dust had completely settled. It was a long, rambling handwritten letter, sent to the Vanguard main office. It was full of the exact kind of manipulative, passive-aggressive language that sounds vaguely like an apology but never actually admits to any specific wrongdoing. There was a lot of, "We never meant for things to turn out this way," and, "I hope you can find it in your Christian heart to forgive us so we can be a family again." I read it exactly once. Then I walked over to the shop's industrial shredder and fed it into the blades. Some doors are much better left permanently closed and deadbolted. I have never heard from my father directly since the day he was hauled out of the courtroom in chains. It is probably for the best. I honestly don't know what I would even say to him anyway. Maybe nothing. Maybe I would just turn my back and walk away. Exactly the same as I did that fateful morning when he threw me against the wall and made his ultimate position crystal clear. His future matters, yours never did. The incredibly funny thing is, he was absolutely right. To him, my future never did matter. I was never a son. I was just a convenient resource to be used and discarded. A stolen credit card to be maxed out. A convenient tool for building the lavish, fake life he desperately wanted for himself and his favorite golden child. But that completely stopped being his call the exact moment I picked myself up off the floor, grabbed my folder, and walked out that front door. If you are reading this massive wall of text, and something in my story feels terrifyingly familiar to your own life, I want you to know something important. Walking away from abusive family isn't quitting. It isn't being selfish. Sometimes, burning the bridge to the ground is the only possible way to stop them from following you, and the only way to start actually living. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out and allows us to bring you even more awesome stories. Thank you so much for watching.